In October 1959, inside the cold stone walls of Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary, violence did not erupt suddenly. It simmered. It waited. The prison known as the Rock held America's most dangerous men, killers, sadists, escape artists trapped on an island surrounded by freezing water and armed guards. Escape was impossible. Survival, however, depended on reputation. And by his 7th year inside Alcatraz, one man had earned a reputation unlike any other. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson was 54 years old, serving a 15-year sentence for federal narcotics conspiracy, older than most inmates, quieter than most, yet watched by everyone. He did not posture. He did not boast. He carried himself with calm authority, the kind that only comes from decades of surviving gang wars, betrayals, and power struggles on the streets of Harlem. Among black inmates, he was more than respected. He was legendary. Among white inmates, he was treated cautiously, even reluctantly. Bumpy had arrived at Alcatraz in 1953, and over 6 years, he established something rare inside a maximum security prison: unspoken balance. No one took his food. No one shoved him in the showers. No one tested him openly. But that balance was about to be challenged, because in October 1959, a new variable had already been poisoning the atmosphere inside Alcatraz for 2 years. A massive, violent, openly racist inmate named Eric Pollson. And when Pollson decided that Bumpy Johnson's quiet respect was an insult to his white supremacy, the prison unknowingly began counting down toward one of the most infamous moments in Alcatraz history. A moment that would last less than 4 seconds but echo for decades. Eric Pollson was exactly the kind of man Alcatraz was built to contain. At 38 years old, he stood over 6'4", weighed nearly 275 pounds of hardened muscle, and carried a reputation forged through extreme violence long before he ever set foot on the Rock. Convicted of 3 separate murders in Texas, each victim, a black man, Pollson, did not hide his racism. He celebrated it. Court records later showed that during his trial, Pollson openly declared that killing black men wasn't really murder, a statement that shocked even hardened prosecutors and judges. He showed no remorse at sentencing, laughed at the judge's condemnation, and promised he would kill again if given the chance. That history followed him into the federal prison system, where Pollson quickly proved too dangerous for standard facilities. After multiple assaults on black inmates at other prisons, officials transferred him to Alcatraz in 1957, believing isolation would control him. Instead, Pollson adapted. He learned how to terrorize without crossing lines that guaranteed permanent solitary confinement. He insulted, humiliated, shoved, and intimidated, always just short of what guards were forced to punish severely. Inside Alcatraz, Pollson cultivated fear, not only among black inmates, but even among white prisoners who didn't want trouble with someone that large, that violent, and that unpredictable. Some guards tolerated him, others quietly agreed with him. And over time, Pollson came to believe something dangerous: that he was untouchable. When he noticed that Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson, older and physically smaller, was receiving respect from both black and white inmates, Pollson saw it not as coincidence, but as defiance. To him, a black man being treated with dignity inside a white-dominated prison hierarchy was unacceptable. And so Pollson made a decision. He would break Bumpy Johnson publicly. He would humiliate him slowly. He would remind everyone watching who he believed truly ruled Alcatraz. What Pollson didn't understand was that Bumpy Johnson had survived men far more powerful than him, and that patience inside prison walls could be more dangerous than rage. The first move came quietly, almost casually, the way true predators prefer to begin. On Friday, the 16th of October, 1959, during the midday meal inside Alcatraz's cafeteria, Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson sat at his assigned table with 3 other black inmates, eating in silence as rules required. The room was tense in its usual way, metal trays clinking, guards watching from elevated positions, Hundreds of men aware that one wrong move could mean weeks in solitary. As Pollson passed by with his own tray, he slowed just long enough to reach down, take Bumpy's dessert, a small slice of apple pie, and walk away without breaking stride. He sat at his own table, ate it deliberately, and stared back at Bumpy with open contempt. Every man at Bumpy's table stiffened, ready to stand, ready to fight. But Bumpy didn't react. He looked briefly at the empty space on his tray, then continued eating as if nothing had happened. To outsiders, it looked like weakness. To men who understood prison politics, it looked like calculation. Pollson noticed that silence and mistook it for fear. 2 days later, on Monday, October 19, the harassment escalated. In the communal showers, with steam rising and guards out of immediate sight, Pollson walked directly toward Bumpy, despite dozens of open stalls. He shoved him hard enough that Bumpy slipped on the wet floor, barely catching himself against the wall. "That's my shower," Pollson said loudly, layering the sentence with racial slurs meant to humiliate as much as threaten. Bumpy stood slowly, water dripping from his shoulders, looked at Pollson for several long seconds, and then stepped aside to another stall without a word. Again, the room went silent. Again, Pollson walked away laughing. By Wednesday, October 21, the pattern was clear to everyone inside Alcatraz. During outdoor recreation, Pollson blocked Bumpy's path and forced him to step aside while shouting insults about white men walking straight and black men walking around. Bumpy complied. He said nothing. That night, whispers filled the cell blocks. Some inmates thought Bumpy was losing his edge. Others suspected something far more dangerous was taking shape. When a fellow inmate finally asked him why he kept enduring the abuse, Bumpy gave a small smile and said only one sentence: "I'm giving him enough rope." Pollson, drunk on his own confidence, had no idea how close he was to the moment where patience would end and consequences would arrive with surgical speed. The final escalation did not begin with Bumpy Johnson. It began with a boy who never should have been involved at all. On Thursday afternoon, the 22nd of October, 1959, during recreation time, a 23-year-old black inmate named Robert Jackson sat alone on a bench, reading quietly. Jackson was small, barely 140 pounds, serving time for postal fraud, not violence. He kept to himself, avoided conflict, and like many young inmates, tried to survive by staying invisible. Pollson noticed him immediately. He walked over, ripped the book from Jackson's hands, and mocked him loudly, sneering about black men reading words without pictures. When Jackson politely asked for the book back, Pollson struck him across the face with it, knocking him off the bench and into the dirt. Then, standing over him, Pollson threw the book into a puddle of filthy water and continued the insults, loud enough for guards and inmates alike to hear. Guards intervened, but only barely. Pollson received a verbal warning and lost a single day of recreation. Jackson was sent to the infirmary with a split lip and a bruised eye. That was the moment everything changed. That evening, inside the cell block, Bumpy Johnson sat with other black inmates and listened as word spread. He said very little, but when he finally spoke, his voice was calm, controlled, and unmistakably final. "Tomorrow," he said, "Pollson would learn a lesson he would remember for the rest of his life." Bumpy explained that he had waited deliberately, that he needed Pollson to cross a line so clear that guards, witnesses, and prison officials would have no choice but to see what followed as inevitable. Pollson had not just insulted him anymore. He had attacked a defenseless young inmate. He had done it publicly, and by doing so, he had unknowingly given Bumpy Johnson exactly what he needed. The next day would be Friday. Lunch would be crowded. Guards would be watching. And the Rock was about to witness an act so fast, so precise, and so devastating that it would become legend inside every federal prison in America. Friday, October 23rd, 1959. Just after noon, the cafeteria at Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary filled the way it always did, nearly 250 inmates filing in under strict supervision, guards positioned along the walls with clear sight lines, rules enforced with military precision. Meals were meant to be quiet, controlled, uneventful, Violence in the cafeteria was rare, not because men weren't capable of it, but because consequences were immediate and brutal. At approximately 12:15 p.m., Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson collected his tray and sat at his assigned table with 3 other inmates, eating calmly, his posture relaxed, his expression unreadable. 2 minutes later, Eric Pollson entered. Instead of sitting at his own table, he walked straight toward Bumpy and slammed his tray down in an empty seat across from him. He spoke loudly, deliberately, making sure others could hear, mocking Harlem, mocking Black Power, mocking the idea that Bumpy Johnson was anything more than another man in a cage. Bumpy didn't look up. That silence enraged Pollson. He leaned forward, escalating his insults, demanding submission, demanding acknowledgement. Then Pollson turned his attention to Robert Jackson, sitting several tables away, still bruised from the previous day. He shouted threats across the cafeteria, promising more punishment, daring anyone to stop him. Guards barked orders for inmates to remain seated. Tension snapped tight. And then Bumpy Johnson stood up. What followed lasted no more than 3 to 4 seconds, according to every witness interviewed afterward. As Bumpy rose, his right hand moved with practiced precision, retrieving a blade hidden against his body, a handmade prison weapon sharpened to a razor edge. He crossed the short distance between the tables in 2 strides. Pollson barely had time to react. The first slash came horizontally across Pollson's face, tearing from cheekbone to jaw, blood erupting instantly. Before Pollson could scream or defend himself, the second strike came upward at an angle, crossing the first wound and destroying his right eye completely. Pollson collapsed backward, screaming, hands covered in blood, the cafeteria exploding into chaos. Guards rushed in, whistles screaming, weapons drawn. Bumpy dropped the blade, raised his hands, and offered no resistance. As he was restrained, he spoke one sentence, clear, calm, and unforgettable. A warning not just to Pollson, but to everyone watching. In that moment, Alcatraz understood something irreversible had just happened. The bully was broken, the balance had shifted, and a legend had been sealed in blood. In the seconds after the attack, order returned to Alcatraz with brutal efficiency. Guards dragged Eric Pollson away in a pool of blood, while others forced inmates to the floor at gunpoint. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson was handcuffed and taken directly to solitary confinement, the blade lying on the cafeteria floor as silent evidence. Pollson survived, but the damage was permanent. The first wound required over 100 stitches and left a scar stretching across his face for life. The second destroyed his right eye completely, leaving him partially blind forever. Within days, the prison launched a full investigation. Over 2 weeks, officials interviewed dozens of witnesses, black inmates, white inmates, even guards. The story that emerged was not chaos, but pattern. Witness after witness described Pollson's sustained campaign of racist harassment, stealing food, shoving Johnson in the showers, blocking his path in the yard, hurling slurs daily, and finally assaulting young Robert Jackson. On the day of the attack, witnesses confirmed that Pollson had seated himself at Johnson's table, escalated verbally, and threatened Jackson publicly. Johnson's own statement was brief and unwavering. He said he acted to defend himself and another inmate after a week of provocation, using only the force necessary to end the threat. Prison officials faced a dilemma: punish Johnson too harshly, and they would be forced to admit that Pollson's behavior had been ignored for years. In the end, they chose containment over confession. Bumpy received 30 days in solitary for possession of a weapon and assault, but no additional years were added to his sentence. Pollson, once healed, was quietly transferred out of Alcatraz. Inside the prison, the message was unmistakable. Racist harassment stopped. No one touched Bumpy's food again. No one shoved black inmates in the showers. Guards watched him differently. Inmates spoke his name with reverence. What happened on October 23, 1959 spread through the federal prison system like wildfire, becoming legend long before Bumpy Johnson ever left the Rock. It wasn't just the violence that made it unforgettable, it was the patience, the timing, and the absolute certainty behind it. 3 seconds had ended a reign of terror and rewritten the rules of respect inside America's most feared prison. What happened inside the Alcatraz cafeteria on October 23rd, 1959, did not end when the blood was cleaned from the floor. It followed Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson for the rest of his life and long after his death. When Bumpy returned to the general population after solitary confinement, the prison felt different. White inmates who once used slurs freely now lowered their voices or stayed silent. Black inmates walked with a little more security, knowing that someone had proven the rules could change when injustice went unanswered for too long. Even guards treated Bumpy with a quiet caution. Not fear, but respect. The story spread beyond Alcatraz, carried by transferred inmates into federal prisons across America. It became legend not because it was brutal, prisons had seen worse, but because it was precise, controlled, and inevitable. A man twice Pollson's age, smaller in size, ended a reign of terror in 3 seconds by understanding something bullies never do. Power is not about strength, but timing. Pollson lived the rest of his life marked by scars he could never hide, physically disfigured and psychologically broken, a walking reminder of what happens when arrogance meets patience sharpened into steel. Bumpy Johnson walked free in 1963, returned to Harlem, and died in 1968, but the lesson he delivered on the Rock outlived them both. Inside prison culture, his warning became immortal. Not loud, not theatrical, just absolute. The quietest man in the room is often the most dangerous. And sometimes, justice doesn't arrive screaming. Sometimes, it arrives calmly, waits for the right moment, and ends everything before anyone realizes it has begun.